Well, if you want to turn to Luke chapter 6, we'll go into the Word. And we took a couple weeks off, but I want to go back into Luke chapter 6. And as I got into Luke 6, which is really there's two accounts, and they kind of go back to back. In all the synoptic gospels, we find the pair of these two go together. And they're both healings, or they're both Sabbath instances. They're both conflicts over the Sabbath. So I want to take a look today. It's just going to be a kind of a two-part. As I got into it, I realized that really without the backstory, without the context, it's super hard to understand kind of the significance of what's playing out in the Gospels. Have you noticed how much conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders, the Pharisees, was always, the Sabbath was in that mix. It was kind of at the center. It was the point of that contention. Not always, but so often it is. And you see this recurring theme throughout the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but especially in John. In John, we have chapters 5, chapter 9, and a large chunk of chapter 7. And these are not small chapters. And they're all over Sabbath conflict. His healing on the Sabbath, what he did on the Sabbath. And so I want to take a look at this. And I want to ask the question is, why is there so much conflict over this issue? Is it just a bunch of grumpy old men and much ado about nothing? Because we read these stories, and without the context, I don't know that we fully understand the significance of what's playing out in the Gospels. Did you know that Jesus was crucified in large part because of the claim that he broke the Sabbath? This just comes up again and again and again. You know, like Matthew chapter 22 and chapter 12 and verse 14. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him, how to destroy him. Mark chapter 3, verse 6, after he heals on the Sabbath. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. John chapter 5 and verse 18. This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. Because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. In John chapter 7, Jesus again brings up this subject. And he says, "Why do you seek to kill me?" And in verse 23, he says, "Are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well?" So this is a big issue. This is in large part what put Jesus on the cross. And so I want to take a look at Luke chapter 6, and I want to examine more closely this conflict on the Sabbath. So if you want to turn Luke chapter 6, I want to read the first 11 verses, and then we'll dive into some background and some context that I hope will help you as you read the Gospels. It'll make them come alive, that you'll understand this conflict. Well, verse 1 of chapter 6 says that on a Sabbath, while he was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence," which is what we spoke of last week. It was not lawful for them to do that. Only the priest by law could eat that bread of the presence. And Jesus says that this was not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." And he rose and he stood there, and Jesus said to them, "I ask you, Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it? And after looking around at them all, he said to them, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury, and they discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. So, for the Pharisees, this is not a secondary issue, clearly. This is a big issue, and there's this conflict. And we'll look at it in 2 weeks. Well, Janet and I are going to be gone next weekend. But so I want to look at the context, though. And to do that, we need to look at the Sabbath in Israel's history. And we need to go back to probably the most devastating moment in Israel's history. What the Holocaust is to the modern Jews, Babylonian captivity was to Israel, the ancient Jews. So I want to take a look at 2 Chronicles chapter 36, because I want you to see the Sabbath in this light. In verse 20, it says, it's talking about the reason that they went into exile to Babylon. In verse 20, he took them into exile into Babylon, those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him, the king of Babylon, and to his sons, until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. Jeremiah had prophesied that they were going to be taken into Babylon for 70 years into captivity. And so the context here is it's providing the reason for that 70 years of captivity, and it was because they had not been keeping the Sabbath to the Lord. Now, 70 years of Sabbath rest equates to 490 years of not keeping Sabbath. Now, if you do the math, and right about year 600 is when they were carried away into captivity, 600 BC. You add 500 and it takes you back to 1100 BC. You quickly realize that the amount of years, the generations that actually kept the Sabbath was few and far between. For all those years of Israel's history, they had not kept the Sabbath. And if you want to take a look, I'm not going to go there today, but Leviticus 26, verse 34, 35, God warned them about what would take place if they did not. And so the question I have again is, why is the Sabbath such a big issue, especially to God? You know, just thinking about it, I would have thought that it would have been Israel's continual idolatry, their rampant sexual sin, or sacrificing children to Moloch, which God just has declared it was a total abomination to him. Well, to really unravel that question, the answer to it is covenant. Because Sabbath is a big deal, because covenants are a big deal to God. And so if you look at biblical covenants, and we're going to go on a little bit of excursion, so hang with me here, but I think you'll find this interesting. I think it'll be fruitful. Biblical covenants, there's two aspects to a biblical covenant. One is an initiation ceremony, and then there is a secondary, a sign of that covenant. It's a continual sign to show that you're continuing faithfulness to the vows that you have made in that covenant. Now today, covenants don't really have that much significance in modern life, but there are remnants. And one of those remnants is marriage. And if I was to ask you, use marriage as an example, what is the initiation rite into marriage covenant? What is it? It's a wedding. That's how you enter into the covenant of marriage. There is a wedding. Well, go back to the old covenant. It has an initiation rite. What is that initiation rite? It's circumcision. Circumcision is a one-time event that brings you into the covenant with God. And so circumcision is that initiation into the old covenant. Well, just an interesting sidelight as we go through this, but In the new covenant, the initiation rite changed, by the way. What is the new initiation rite in the new covenant? What is the one-time event that brings you into covenant relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ? It's baptism. That's the initiation. The baptism brings you into covenant relationship. Well, let's go back to the old covenant, that second part, the sign of the covenant. Now, what is the sign in marriage? Using that again as an illustration. And what is the sign of the covenant of marriage? The sign that says that I'm still in this marriage. I'm still faithful to this marriage. I still keep my vows. I saw Dan. He's got the answer. You get right here. This is the sign of the covenant. This is a universal sign in our culture for what it means that I'm married. And it's not just a communication to you that I'm married to Janet, but it is also a communication to myself. When I see the ring on my finger, it's to be a remembrance to me, a reminder to me of my vows, that I vowed that I would be faithful in covenant relationship with Janet. Well, in the Old Covenant, there's an interesting thing before we go there. Just another example. So you take a look at the flood. There was a covenant that God made with all of humanity, in fact, all of life. And what was that covenant? That he would never again destroy the world by flood. Did you realize that he gave a sign of that covenant? And do you remember what the sign was? It's in Genesis 9, verse 12 and 13. And it says that, and God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you. For all future generations, I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth." Every time that you see it, we lose sight of this. We see the rainbow, and that's beautiful. Let's get the camera and let's take a picture. And do you understand what that is? That's God saying, I'm still in this covenant. I'm still faithful to this covenant. That promise that I made all those thousands of years ago to Noah, I still do. I'm still faithful to that covenant. Okay, so the old covenant that was made between God and his people Israel, what was the sign of the covenant? Does anybody know? It's the Sabbath. It's the Sabbath. And so if you take a look at like Exodus chapter 31, verses 12 and 13. And the Lord said to Moses, "You are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all you shall keep my Sabbaths." Why? Well, he says, "For this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations." Drop down 4 verses to verse 16. "Therefore the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant forever. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel." Do you understand the significance of that? Is that every week they were to keep the Sabbath because that was the sign that they are in the covenant. I'm keeping my vows, God. I'm in this covenant. It's like wearing a ring. It's like wearing a ring. It's saying that I'm remembering the vows and I'm staying in this covenant relationship. We're going to talk about that a little bit more, but look, do you know what's the sign in the new covenant? It's interesting. It is communion. It's how we remember our vows. What did Jesus ask his disciples to do in remembrance of him? Remembrance, that's covenant language, by the way. And so when we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, in the same way, Jesus, took the cup after supper saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." And he says this, "Do this Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. Covenant language. It's the sign that you are still in covenant relationship faithfully to me. In Luke chapter 22 and verse 19, it records that he, Jesus, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Covenant language. The Lord's table, communion, his bread and his cup. That's covenant with God in the New Testament context. But let's go back. Let's take a look. I've asked that question, why is the Sabbath such a big deal? Well, let me give you an illustration. If I were to take my ring off, and thinking of the covenant of marriage, and I was to throw it in the trash can, and I was to go to bars, and I was to chase other women, and it was not a one-time thing, but I did this continually, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. What is Janet's response to that? Not good. Not good. I've totally disregarded my covenant vows, my relationship, my covenantal faithfulness. I want you to picture God in that light. God has made a covenant with Israel. They have totally disregarded that covenant, and they chase after other gods again and again. On every green hill, it says, they're constantly being unfaithful to God, chasing other gods, going to high places. What is God's reaction to that? Read the story of Hosea and Gomer. You'll get a context of how God sees this unfaithfulness, the hurt, the betrayal that has been done to God. What I wanted to suggest to you today is that the ring is not the ring. It's not the issue. It's my unfaithfulness. I could wear the ring and do the same things, but they would be just as hurtful. You understand? The ring is not the issue. It's the promise, the vows that went with the ring that is the issue. I have not kept them. I have not honored them. I've dismissed them. I've treated them without any honor whatsoever. So in a sense, Israel has thrown away that covenant ring and going to the high places. And God is telling them, you've broken your vows to me. You have not been faithful to me. The Sabbath is not the issue. Covenantal faithfulness is the issue. The Sabbath is the tip of the iceberg, as it were. That was the sign of the covenant that was meant to show that Israel was still in covenant relationship with their God. So for this reason, Babylon spends 70 years in captivity, 70 years to consider her unfaithfulness. When Israel comes back from those 70 years of captivity, there is a new commitment, a new resolve to again be faithful to their God. But if you know the story, you also know that the resolve doesn't always last for very long. And there is a sliding, a slipping back, and the Sabbath breaking becomes common again. And we read that in Nehemiah chapter 13. And in verse 15 of chapter 13, it says, "In those days I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on donkeys, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on the day which they sold food." And skipping down to verse 18. And Nehemiah continues to confront them. And he says, "Did not your fathers act in this same way? And did not our God bring all this disaster on us and upon this city? Now you are bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." You see the issue. They're again just coming right back into that place of covenantal unfaithfulness. And Nehemiah, God through Nehemiah, is confronting them again on that. Well, if you fast forward again a number of hundreds of years to the year 170 AD, and we come to a place where Greece now has authority and rule over Israel. And there comes a man to power from the north, the Seleucids. His name was Antiochus Epiphanes. This is a lot of history. I hope you find this interesting. But Antiochus Epiphanes, that word Epiphanes, which is interesting, it means God revealed. This was the title he gave himself. He's saying, when you see me, you've seen God revealed. And interesting, he had a diabolic hatred for God and all things that were faithful to him, to God. And so he went into the Holy of Holies, and he had them put a statue of Zeus there. The statue of Zeus, and I've mentioned this, I think, before, but do you know whose face was on Zeus? It was the face of Antiochus. And he had them sacrifice a pig in the Holy of Holies and scatter its blood throughout the walls of the Holy of Holies. He's just desecrating, just as vile as a man can be. A hatred, diabolical hatred. He, by the way, is interesting, often believed to be, and I agree with this, that if there's coming a man of sin, a son of perdition, an antichrist, he will mirror Antiochus Epiphanes. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus spoke, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, Daniel the prophet, he was speaking about Antiochus's day. And so, Antiochus Epiphanes, he forbids any mothers or fathers to circumcise their children upon death. And he killed many. He found that a child had been sacrificed. The one who did the circumcision was killed. The one who, the mother, the father, the whole family was killed. Now, he also makes the observance of Sabbath a capital offense, Antiochus does. And he makes possessing the Torah, the book of the covenant, a capital offense as well. You can read of this in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, 57. And if you haven't, I'd encourage you to read Maccabees, 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees. A lot of valuable context is found there. But chapter 1 and verse 57 says that anyone found possessing the book of the covenant, or anyone who adhered to the law, was condemned to death by decree of the king. That's about as dark of a position that you can find yourself in, where a man has determined satanically to destroy God's covenant on planet Earth. Just a hatred for all things God and Israel, the Jews. And in that darkness, God raises up a man, Judas Maccabees, and in 167, he stands up. His father was the one that initiated it, but they were supposed to offer a sacrifice to Zeus, and Judas's dad stands up and he kills that officer, that Greek officer, and the man, the Jew that had violated the covenant, and he starts a rebellion. And they for 3.5 years, they fought. But they just said that they're just making this statement: we will not bow the knee to any but Yahweh, to God alone. We will not be unfaithful to our covenant vows, no matter what. If you read the book of Maccabees, you'll read the story of the mother with 7 sons, who they stood there and they said, "We'll kill your son if you do not renounce your covenant faithfulness." They killed the first son, the second son. All 7 sons died, and then they killed her. But this is the kind of faithfulness we're talking about to God, to His covenant. They will not violate the covenant vows that they have made with God. That's 200 years before Christ. Why am I saying this story? Why am I even bringing this up when we're talking about Luke chapter 6? That group of people that gathered around Judas Maccabees, what became of those people? They have a name. What is it? Do you know? Anyone want to guess? They're called the Pharisees. The Pharisees. God raised up the Pharisees to stand against the darkness, and they bravely did so at the cost of their own lives. They were God's people in that moment, and they stood for righteousness bravely and boldly. But something tragic happened in 200 years. They were still about the covenant. They had all the trappings. They said the same things. They put rules upon rules upon rules to protect the covenant. They not only would say, do not do any work on the Sabbath, but they would further specify, well, how much can you carry? Well, how far can you go? How rule upon rule upon rule to protect the Sabbath. But in this place, they have forgotten the love of the one that called them into covenant relationship. There's a sense in which the ring became more important than the one to whom the vows were made. That ring I'm talking about was Sabbath. And the Sabbath became, their allegiance was to the Sabbath above all else. They were rule keepers, but they had forgotten the love that they were meant to have for their God. This is not unique to the Pharisees. This is the way of all human institutions. Even those that begin in pure devotion, given time, those institutions tend to lose their way. This is true of the Pharisees, but it's also true of the Christian church as well, that unless we continually turn our hearts and our devotion back to our God in true covenant love, true covenant faithfulness, we lose our way. In Luke chapter 6, what we read as we began in verse 2, the disciples are walking through the grain fields and Jesus with them. And the Pharisees ask that question. It's a condemning question. Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Did you see the context of what they still have that intense desire? We are a people of the covenant and we will not allow any breaking of the Sabbath. In Luke chapter 6, in verse 9, after Jesus heals the man with the withered hand, Jesus asked them, I say to you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it? And it says that they do not say anything. And you'll see this occur again in Luke chapter 14, a different healing, but the same exact scenario. The hardness, the coldness of heart. There in their midst was the Lord of the Sabbath, the Lord of the covenant. Standing in front of them is the very one that they had sworn their lives in covenant allegiance to. But instead of worship, of devotion, of acceptance, there's only anger and hatred and fury at the one who stood before them. How then can what began with such a pure devotion to God get so far off the track? Well, it doesn't take 200 years to get off course. In fact, while it is a gradual process, once it begins in the life of a believer, it doesn't take long to happen. A few short months, even maybe years. But if left unchecked, it will take root and take hold. And that which was once a vibrant, living faith, a commitment to God, a vow that I will live a life in covenantal faithfulness to my God, becomes a shell of what it once was. Jesus confronted the Pharisees. Do you remember what he said concerning them? It's in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 27, and he tells them, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. That picture, if you knew how important to a Pharisee covenantal cleanness meant to them, The thought that they would be filled with dead men's bones and all uncleanness is, but that is Jesus was getting at the very heart of it. A people that had all the trappings, all the facade. They were saying all the right things. They were technically doing the right things, but they had no pure love, devotion, commitment to God whatsoever. It was just all empty, dead, void. I want to close kind of here today, actually. It's an odd place. I want to, in 2 weeks, go back into Luke chapter 6, take a look at these verses and begin to really look at this conflict between them, the Pharisees and Jesus. But what I want to leave you with today is that God is looking still for purity of heart, a loving devotion, a devotion, a covenantal faithfulness that is not just going through the motions, but is true. And so I close with this question: how is your heart? How is your heart? Is all well with your soul? If Jesus was to examine the inner, what lies within, would he see a pure and loving devotion to him? Or would he see deadness, emptiness, and a void that is just going through the motions? What I want to challenge you today is the ring is not what it's about. The ring is those outward expressions of devotion, of covenantal faithfulness. But if covenantal faithfulness is all we have, and you do not have that living, pure devotion to our Lord God, it's null, it's void, it means nothing. It counts for nothing. I am concerned about the church in the West. There's a lot of outward trappings. I'm afraid we've become Pharisees. And we've lost the pure devotion of love to our Lord Jesus Christ. I want us just to take a moment, and I want us to go back. Last week we took communion together, and I presented the Lord's body. What I want us to look at is the vows that we make, that we made, that as we take part in communion with Him, the vows. And I want us to stop and just ask the question, am I still in this covenant? Do I still do? Am I still in love with Jesus? And if the answer is that my love is waning, my love is flickering, I want you to tell him that. And ask him to forgive that. To stir again a fire within you. So would you do that? Let's just take some time here. Just renew the vows. Father, I thank you that You're still a God of faithfulness. Still a God of covenant. And you still desire to be in relationship with us. Father, I ask that you would confront my deadness of heart. Lord, where I have embraced a covenantal faithfulness that does not include an utter and complete giving of myself in love to you, I pray that you would cast that down. You'd cast down that place of pride, spiritual arrogance, spiritual deadness, whether that place be Sabbath, whether that be a doctrine, whatever that is, that we take confidence in our righteousness apart from Jesus Christ. Pray that it would be destroyed, torn down. We give ourselves, Lord, to you in utter and complete allegiance to Jesus and Jesus alone. And I thank you, Lord, that you are still calling us to be covenantally faithful. We want to be truly children living in right and pure relationship with you. I pray, Lord, that you would continually restore us because we need it. And we just thank you for your faithfulness again. Amen.